thank you all so much for joining us for today's program, A History of Boston's Long Black Freedom Struggle. And it is my pleasure, my privilege to introduce Dr. Zebulon Vance Miletsky. He is an associate professor of Africana Studies. His new book, Before Busing, A History of Boston's Long Black Struggle, was published by the University of North Carolina Press, and it was released about a year ago, December 2022. Dr. Miletsky is a historian specializing in recent African-American history, civil rights and Black power, urban history, mixed race and biracial identity, and hip-hop studies. His research interests include African Americans in Boston, Northern freedom movements outside of the South, and mixed racial history in the US and passing. He is the author of numerous articles, reviews, essays, and book chapters, and recently worked on an edited volume on new directions in Boston African American history and school desegregation. He is also at work on his second monograph, A History of Interracial Marriage and Racial Passing in Boston and in Massachusetts. He has a PhD in African American Studies with a concentration in history, which he got at the University of Amherst back in '08. So, and again, want to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Library for sponsoring. And for all of us watching live, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Dr. Miletsky. And Doctor, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Robert. I appreciate that warm introduction, and just thrilled. I have to say, being able to speak to my understanding is a number of libraries in Massachusetts, near New Hampshire border, and some other areas in New England. It means a lot to me as a Boston, as someone who grew up in Boston, who now admittedly lives in New York, in Brooklyn. So it's always nice to have a chance to speak back to the place, especially in this case, since the book is about Boston, seeing all the different geographical names and places pop up. It's a wonderful, wonderful opportunity. So thank you very much. I want to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Library and all the libraries that are participating today. Going to just get started and bring up my presentation, just so we definitely, take advantage of the time and have enough time for questions and all those kinds of things, because I found that, we usually get a number of different inquiries and questions, and I'm sure this audience will be no different. So thank you for being here for this talk, A History of Boston's Long Black Freedom Struggle, which is the subtitle of the book, and the book title, of course, being Before Busing. Came up with that title, I guess, for the reason that I felt that Boston kind of needed a new discussion, a new sort of narrative. And my sort of very simplistic idea is that if we know what happened sort of leading up to some of the events that we are more familiar with or think we're more familiar with, if we have a little bit more context, basically the historian's job, is to provide historical context. But I think in this case in particular, because busing or school desegregation has historically been such a controversial topic, has been a painful topic. I don't think there's any profit in denying that it's been a emotionally wrenching experience for many Bostonians, both Black and white, and everyone. Social change often is, but in this case, I think, as many probably already know, the process of school desegregation in Boston, even though this happened in so many cities, southern and northern spaces, the outcry, the political sort of controversy, the pain, um, and just sort of the path that this set the city upon um, seemed to be a little bit more intense than other places. Um, the sort of the violence that accompanied and was ushered in by this process made headlines across the country and internationally. Um, and the images of some of the outpouring of emotion, I'll call it, um, was ubiquitous in terms of film, video, and print media. And so, um, because of that, um, whenever you bring up the topic of school desegregation or busing, it tends to bring up similar feelings, I find, even today, with those who lived through the history and those who are living through the aftermath of the history, which I count myself in that category. So, um, so I felt that talking about the history before busing, um, what led up to this moment that seemed to many people to really come out of the blue. Um, uh, it wasn't out of the blue. There was a long history that led up to that moment, and that made this sort of situation come about. And I'm just gonna, if I may, I think the best way to do this, if I can, I'm just gonna read a little bit from the preface of the book. And the title of the preface, and those of you who may have the book already might have seen this already, and if you don't, this will be something that you'll get to read if you buy the book. The preface is titled "The Arc of the Moral Universe in Boston." The year 2022 marks 50 years since 14 Black families and 44 children in Boston found the courage to file a lawsuit with the help of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, against the city of Boston in federal district court contesting school segregation. Unlike the somewhat inauspicious anniversary of the resulting court order in 1974, which of course this is the year of, perhaps a better case could be made for the recognition of 1972 of a year worthy of recognition. After all, it is hardly worth celebrating an anniversary that so many people found to be painful. Bostonians suffer from an incomplete story. How many of them know that in 1972, Black parents in Boston enlisted the help of lawyers from the Harvard University Center for Law and Education, including a young Tom Atkins, who was a student at Harvard Law School, to sue the city's school committee, arguing that Boston was maintaining two separate school systems. This is a much different narrative than the one that has dominated over the last 50 years, that this was a unilateral decision, which felt more like an edict to some from a power-hungry federal judge who didn't live in Boston and whose own children attended schools in Wellesley, is how many Bostonians remember the decision to implement busing. In this case, the source of pain and strife that appeared to come as a bolt from the blue was actually initiated by a legitimately aggrieved group of parents and children who had been treated unjustly. Like all Bostonians, these parents paid local taxes and were entitled to a quality education for their children from its public school system, a constitutional right, something which they had been denied. The federal court was literally, as Tom Atkins called it, the court of last resort. In the case of an absolutely defiant and intransigent school committee, after almost 9 years of protest, the founding of Freedom Schools, Black independent schools, Operation Exodus, Metco, and many other creative ways of gaining a better education for their beloved children, the somewhat reluctant plaintiffs agreed to file suit against the school committee. After years of warring with Louise Day Hicks, whom Noel Day, the executive director of the St. Mark's Social Center, and co-organizer of the Stay Out for Freedom movement called the Sheriff Jim Clark of Boston. The parents would finally see their day in court. The trial took 2 years to decide. Few realized what was in store for Boston. The case was Morgan versus Hennigan, named for the lead plaintiff, Tallulah Morgan, who, with the help of the NAACP, Freedom House, and other Black community groups, filed this federal suit. And so I'm going to stop there and maybe come back to it. But of course, this is my opinion. One of the good things about, being a historian or writing your own book, I should say, is, is putting forward what one thinks. And it doesn't mean that it's the only way to look at it. It's just the way that I'm arguing in the book. And the rest of the book pretty much provides the evidence to sort of support this approach. It's a different approach, obviously, than ones that have been sort of more popularly known. And this book here that I'm showing on this slide, entitled Why Busing Failed, I think captures probably a more a larger number of people who feel this is how most people feel, or many people feel, I should say, not just in Boston and Massachusetts, but nationally, about busing, that it was a failure, that it was unsuccessful. There's no point in denying that. Whenever I speak with folks, people, that is the overwhelming opinion that people have had, and you can't. I would never dare try to change anyone's opinion necessarily, except from reading the facts and information as presented, because sometimes we're not always given the entire picture. In fact, I found to be the case that a lot of the people who were active in the anti-busing efforts in neighborhoods like South Boston at first, and then eventually Charlestown, East Boston, and other parts of the city, today, 50 years hence, with a little more information and different sources, a lot of them say, we never heard that stuff. We were told, sort of by, and I think the facts demonstrate that people were told by the politicians of the era at that time, things that scared them. They're coming to take their schools away. There's this court order, and it gives them the right to do X, Y, and so and so. And most importantly, your son or daughter is not going to be able to go to their same neighborhood school anymore. They're going to have to go across town, et cetera, et cetera. So the information was not necessarily readily available to people on their own, and it came through other mediums. And some of those mediums had political agendas, and overpromised, quite frankly. A lot of the leadership on the anti-busing side, they overpromised to their constituents about things that they had no power to do, like stop a federal court order that doesn't come out of nowhere. Remember, the court order comes as a result of the lawsuit of people taking the opportunity to exercise their legal right to bring suit, and also pretty reasonably minded people who tried really every other resort, because, as we all know, suing someone or bringing a lawsuit against a school committee or even another person is a big thing to do. And it's something you want to avoid if possible. And actually, the movement did try to avoid it, but their voices literally were not being heard. But this is an excellent book. And actually, if get a chance to read through it, you realize that the author is not saying that busing failed at all, but really was, as you see in the subtitle, race, media, and the national resistance. It was, in many cases, the media. It was, in many cases, the political people aspiring to higher office and so on, utilizing this as a wedge issue to move up. There was a recent documentary that I'm sure at least a few people on here may have seen. That came on PBS, called The Busing Battleground. And I think the title says it all, and the image. And so I'm going to just play that, if I can, for context, to help to understand some of the story as it led up to that. And to do that, I'm going to have to stop sharing, and then I'm going to reshare my screen. Okay, and so this is a short clip that explains the state of the Boston public schools and the stark differences between schools in Black and white communities in Boston.
As a student in training to be a teacher and visiting Boston schools and then visiting as well schools in the suburbs, the differences were extreme. So in the suburban schools, I would see these beautiful new school buildings, modern science labs, modern auditoriums. And I'd go back to visiting a school in Boston, I'd say, like, are we in the same world, the same planet, the same state? Why are schools in Boston underfunded and disgraceful looking?
The schools in the African American community were even less well off. The school buildings were older, the resources less.
Black schools were located in some of the oldest school buildings in Boston. They were missing basic resources like paper, pencils, pens. But they also didn't have lunchrooms, and they didn't have libraries in some cases, or gymnasiums.
The school building, which I taught in Boston, was something out of a Charles Dickens novel. We taught 2, 3, 4 classes all in the same unpartitioned, noisy auditorium day after day. Kids there were loaded with substitute teachers. Walls were peeling paint. Blackboards were collapsing.
My elementary teachers were all white. There was nothing about Black history or the contributions of other minorities to this country. I knew all the Irish songs. The basketball coach, he had us saying Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord be with, and we're all Black kids, most of us Baptists.
Okay. So back to the okay. Yes, okay. So yeah, I think that's quite telling. And it's a much longer documentary, and I encourage everyone to watch it. But just getting a sense there of what it means to be Black in a city like Boston. These were the some of the realities. So why Boston? Why did I write about this? Uh, Part of it has to do, I'm sure, with the fact that I grew up there, grew up in Jamaica Plain, went to Boston Public Schools my whole life, um, never went to school outside of Roxbury, went to the William Monroe Trotter, excellent elementary school, the Phyllis Wheatley Middle School, which is actually no longer in existence, and what was Boston Technical High School, now called the John D. O'Brien School, whose photo is you see on this slide. And it's hard. I've found harder than I thought. It's quite intimidating in some ways to write a book about Boston, and especially one about race in Boston, because Boston has these sort of very lofty myths, noble in so many ways, connected with American history, and from the outset, a very high aspirational level in terms of being, the city upon a hill, for instance. All over the years, all the different sort of ways that the popular imagination thinks about Boston. And it's intimidating in a sense where Boston's such an educated space with so many smart people, with strong opinions about history, about the city, and also great love for the city of Boston. So it's complicated. One person's Boston may be very different from another person's experience. And so contending with the myths, the various myths, Boston, the cradle of liberty, Boston, freedom's birthplace, you name it. Boston's been part of the discussion, partly because it's one of the oldest cities in America. And also it's just its association with the founding of America, the Mayflower, Plymouth Plantation, and then all the sort of high-minded mentalities about Boston coming from even from scripture. Boston shall be a city upon a hill. And so the way that I sort of approached this was to think about Boston as having a paradox. The paradox of race in Boston is another piece in terms of deconstructing some of the myths. In the book, I talk about Bostonian exceptionalism, and I describe, a little bit about what that idea is, and it's very similar to American exceptionalism. Boston, in terms of symbolism, in terms of its history, in terms of the noble ideals about democracy and so on, like America, historically has had trouble always living up to those high-minded ideals. But Boston deserves credit, however, as does America, for at least expressing those ideals and uh, the process of trying to little by little expand the notion of democracy and pluralism for more and more groups. Um, but there is this sort of paradox, because the other piece of this is that a lot of African Americans, especially in other parts of the country, have a sense of Boston being kind of until they actually went there and arrived there. I heard this over and over again in my interviews. People had this expectation that Boston would be a little bit more open place. It would be, if there was a city in America where African Americans would have more rights, not less, more mobility, more options, it would have been Boston in the minds of many people. Why is that? Well, for example, the 19th century, Boston is the home of the abolitionist movement, headquarters in a sense. Um, uh, but I also learned in writing this book that just because you have a very committed band of abolitionists does not mean the entire city thinks the way that they do, or that the entire Commonwealth does. But you do have that powerful sort of messaging and symbolism around Boston. Uh, Even today, a lot of people will describe Boston as a liberal place, a liberal city, and yet those of us who live there, work there, know about it, know that it's a little bit more complicated than that. Sometimes we have a wide array of different perspectives. But anyway, I have this image, the night James Brown saved Boston. This is an example to me of this idea of exceptionalism. This, if you know the history, and I talk about this in one of the chapters in the book, there was this concert that was planned well in advance of April 1968. It just so happened that would have fallen on the day after that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And so the city, Mayor White at the time, was a great scramble to figure out what to do about this concert. And this is a wonderful documentary, The Night James Brown Saved Boston, with many redeeming qualities. But the fact is that the truth of the matter is that Boston did have less looting and less riots that did take place on the night of King's assassination in many other cities. And it's attributed to this concert, which was going to be canceled, but Mayor White insisted that the concert go forward. So it's kind of an interesting dilemma there, you know, this mentality of the night James Brown saved Boston, which is a great story, and I love James Brown. The title of the chapter is say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud, because of what he did and inspired so many young people. But Mayor White kind of used that to his advantage to keep teens and young people off the streets in particular, because of fear of rioting, especially in downtown Boston. There was rioting and burning along Blue Hill Avenue and in North Dorchester or Dorchester in the Black community. So, uh, so we're always eager to tell the story of a positive view of race relations in Boston, but the truth is a little bit more complicated. I mentioned Tom Atkins at the outset. Tom Atkins is somebody I think everybody needs to study and know a lot about because he really is a hero in this tale. He's originally from Indiana, like a lot of people who especially became part of the Black leadership in Boston. He comes from outside of Boston. This is also a factor to always one has to consider in Boston because so many people come to Boston to go to school. A lot of them fall in love with the city and end up staying. And like Tom Atkins and Chuck Turner is another example of that, Hubie Jones, the list goes on and on. You'd be surprised how many people are actually from New York who are New Yorkers who've been in Boston so long that we just think of them as Bostonians. But Tom Atkins was an attorney, became a member of the Boston City Council, and he was part of the general council of the Boston branch of the NAACP, eventually head of the Boston NAACP. But he was tied in to the National Association of Colored People, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the same that brought the suit, the famous suit of Brown versus Board of Education that made that huge change in terms of desegregating schools in the South. When I went to look at all the archives and records, it was very clear that the NAACP was always planning, eventually their goal was to do the same that they did in the South, to do it in the North. And Boston was very high up, as you can imagine, on that list. But it was a Northern desegregation program and plan that was for Detroit, for Boston, for New York, and for many other cities. And Tom Atkins was a key part of that. And one of the reasons that the movement ended up in Boston, contrary to popular belief, was so effective. And that brings me to the point exactly why I wrote this book, because the narrative has been obscured in a lot of ways, and this very effective, nuanced, sophisticated strategy of effective organizing, which totally transformed the Boston Public Schools, like it or hate it, and transformed the city, was because of brilliant minds like Tom Atkins, Mel King, Chuck Turner. Was like, his IQ is like off the, these were really brilliant folks. I also felt that, you couldn't write a book about Boston, Massachusetts without talking about the very influential, very impactful Irish American contribution and experience, and how that relates especially to the African American experience. Now, you're probably like, what are we looking at here? This is an 1866 cartoon from a newspaper in Washington, D.C., commenting on the desegregation of city streetcars in Washington, D.C. The Black woman on the right is depicted as a lady of beauty, refinement, and wealth. On the left, here, I don't know if you can see the Irish American woman is stereotyped with ape-like features and working class attire. And a servant or housewife, Mrs. McCafferty, has been to the market to purchase fresh produce and fish. Her basket also, as it states here, or as you can it doesn't state, but as you can see in the cartoon, there's 2 bottles of some kind of alcoholic beverage. And so what we're looking at here is a very destructive and very damaging and objectionable stereotype, not against African Americans, but against Irish Americans. And this is something that is very important to understand. The discrimination against, no one's disputing the discrimination and racism and prejudice against African Americans. That's been very well documented. But what is, I think, a little less well known by people is the discrimination, prejudice against the Irish and against Catholics in general. quite frankly. This is, part of our history in the United States as well. Um, the anti-Catholic sentiment that existed in the late 19th century. You had the Know Nothing Party or the Nativist Party. Um, they actually called themselves the Native Americans, ironically, who were really white Anglo-Saxon Protestant derivation, who looked down upon the Irish. And so, so the point is that I think historically race relations between Irish and African Americans, I think, are pretty well known to have been fraught with a lot of difficulties and sort of animosity on both sides. But what I'm suggesting here is that that is a manipulation that has really been done by the true ruling class of this country and of Boston, the proper Bostonian, if you will, the Boston Brahmin, the sort of blue-blooded, Beacon Hill, so who from the English tradition, who settled Boston essentially. Once the Irish start coming in large numbers in the late 19th century, there is this hatred and animosity toward them that exists. I read a book when I was in graduate school called How the Irish Became White by Noel Ignatian. And that may be hard pill for some to accept or to swallow, but that was his contention. And he argues in the book, how that process took place. It is hard to believe that Irish Americans would not be considered white in America, but then they, along with many other ethnic white groups like Italians and others, they're on the hierarchy. It wasn't necessarily that they weren't considered white, but that they were maybe a little bit lower on the ladder of whiteness. Why don't we say it like that? And they face real persecution. But even by 1963, by 1960, John F. Kennedy is running for president, and people wondered aloud, can America, is America ready to elect a Catholic president? So it's sort of forgotten today, but there was prejudice, discrimination, and stereotypes, very devastating stereotypes against the Irish that make them, I think, feel a little bit defensive. And it's a big part of understanding this conflict, in my humble opinion. Here's a photograph, a famous one or infamous, of well, I think the picture says 1,000 words, as they say. This gentleman here, Ted Landsmark, was on his way to a meeting with the mayor of City Hall, heading to City Hall, which is City Hall Plaza here, and became in danger of being either stabbed or impaled. It looks like a stabbing, but it turns out he's actually swinging that flag. But either way, very dangerous situation, and the symbolism is undeniable. What does it mean to be American? What is America? And things had fallen, gotten so bad by this point. And people really were shocked across the country about the violence that accompanied and this anger, this palpable anger that accompanied busing. Unfortunately, lost in all that confusion is a chance to really drill down and understand why people felt the way they felt. Rightly or wrongly, a lot of people felt that they were themselves persecuted and defending their neighborhoods, defending their rights. And it makes a lot of sense to me as an African American studies scholar, because I know the history and the ways in which the Irish were seen as not too far away from African Americans in that hierarchy of race. That may not be how they saw themselves, but that's certainly how the larger country in some ways saw them. And had these two groups ever actually been able to unite and see their commonality, well, that would have represented a great potential for change in this country. And as some of you know, that's not something that everybody always wants to see. And from a class perspective, etc. And I can't say much more about it because I'll move on. But these groups are certainly pitted against one another in terms of labor, strike breaking, bread and butter issues that affected people's ability to put food on the table. And that's no joke. And so people took stuff like this very seriously. It was hard for African Americans in Boston to get journeyman licenses to be a electrician, to be to get a construction or skilled labor. All of these things pitted these two groups, unfortunately, against one another. Fast forward to the present day, or somewhat recent history, people started talking about busing all of a sudden again around 2019 during the Democratic debate. You may recall when Kamala Harris was running for president, she challenged our current president and her future running mate, Joe Biden, about his stance on busing and some of the comments that was making at the time about busing. And she famously said, there was a little girl in California who was bused to school. That little girl was me. And it's a great moment in American political history, I think, and debate history. You see Joe Biden does a double take, turns around very quickly. And she got his attention, and she got the attention of the nation. So there are people still carrying the scars, certainly. Those kids on the bus, she was one of them, who went through this experience and had a story to tell about it. It got people thinking and talking about it again. As I started to say at the outset, the case of Morgan versus Hennigan, I don't even think that enough people, we don't know the name of this case like we do, say, Brown versus Board. We've learned over many, many years of Black History Months, like the one we're in now. People have heard about Brown versus Board of Education, or maybe they haven't, but maybe more people have heard and we sort of settled on that as a positive good. In Boston, I don't think even people have taken the time to know Morgan versus Hennigan. Again, named for the lead plaintiff, Tallulah Morgan, one of those 14 Black families. In court cases, they usually take Brown versus Board. There was other families involved besides Brown. They usually take the first name, versus Hennigan, who was the president of the school committee at that time. 14 Black families who brought the lawsuit. And I'm just going to, again, read a little bit. James Hennigan, charging discrimination in school assignments, staffing. They charge discrimination in school assignments, staffing, and allocation of resources, facilities, and transportation. Legal precedents in Denver and Detroit supported the plaintiff's case. One of the questions that needs to be asked, which this book seeks to do, is whether Boston is a better city for these changes. Boston has been very fiscally successful, making it one of the most expensive U.S. cities to live in. I don't know if that's a good thing, but it's been financially successful. Has Boston thrived financially from dealing with its racial problems? If that is the case, then why is so little known about the courageous men, women, and children who saw a better future for Boston and set about to bring it to fruition? Why do so few people know about the lawsuit and the struggle itself, which brought about a better Boston? Why does so much rancor still exist about school desegregation? Now, so we may all have different opinions about this, but I think, in America, any group who's pushed very far against the wall will eventually have to avail themselves of those rights. And that's kind of how the system works. Now, school desegregation, in the way that it ended up happening, it didn't have to happen that way. If the school committee had cooperated, or even been willing to cooperate at all, things could have been handled more amicably outside of court. But as we all know, once you go to court, then you're putting it in the hands of the judge, Garrett in this case, who, as we know, settled on a remedy that was a difficult one for the city, and one that was by the book and very stringent in so many ways. It's also just a factor of the timing of things. There was the decision was handed down in June, and school was set to start in September. It didn't leave a lot of time to come up with a plan. And so they ended up having to adopt the only plan that was already written, I believe, by the Department of Education in Massachusetts, uh, coming out of the Racial Imbalance Act and in accordance with the Racial Imbalance Law of 1965. And so again, once that goes into the hands of the courts, then you get a much different outcome. And it was difficult for the city. It was um, being forced to do something in a sense by court order as opposed to doing it voluntarily, which is what should have happened. And if that could have happened, that would have been nice, but it was not even on the table. This is a photo of Martin Luther King marching through Roxbury. The other thing, and I just want to be aware of time here, the other thing that Boston had on that Black Bostonians, I should say, had on their side was the power of a Martin Luther King. Because King went to Boston University, he's Dr. Martin Luther King because he has a PhD in divinity from BU. He spent, it takes about 5-6 years to get a PhD. He spent those years in Boston, and they ended up being very formative years for him. He kind of fell in love with the city, as so many do. He actually met Coretta. I think everyone knows this more now. He met Coretta Scott King in Boston, so it is a matter of the heart for him. Very strongly connected. He preached at the 12th Baptist Church in Roxbury. He spoke at the Ford Hall Forum. He did all manner of things while he was in the city, and he carried those memories and an understanding of a clear understanding about the problem around school desegregation. And comes in April of 1965, marches from Roxbury to the Boston Common and gives a very powerful speech, both there in the Common and at the General Court in the Massachusetts State Legislature. And I went and found all those archives and all those famous words, and it's very telling about the problem, as only King could do in the most eloquent way that we know that he does. So busing overshadows everything. My theory, or a hope, I should say, is that looking at Boston before busing allows us to see several things. It allows us to see, first of all, that Boston was not always, I hear this all the time, you've got to have a good understanding about the reality of the city. Roxbury was a changing neighborhood in so many ways. It was actually a strong Jewish population there. Blue Hill Avenue in Dorchester and leading into Mattapan itself was, as I'm sure someone on here knows, was such a bastion of a Jewish community. Someone like myself coming along a little later years may not have known that, and I didn't, but they're clues. Jewish Memorial Hospital in Roxbury, the storefronts along Blue Hill Avenue that sell Jamaican and West Indian food today, but used to be famous delis, legendary delis in the city. There's a hidden history there. And this photo, I think, is a good example of that. You see kids learning together. This is at an elementary school, and this is probably in the 1950s. And so Boston has gone this way before. Even in the 19th century, actually had a school desegregation fight. So even that isn't new. What happened in the 70s is actually an echo of something that happened already in the 19th century. But we also have to contend with that virulent, vicious hatred and as things like this, horrible images, and so it's a difficult paradox. Boston being the city upon a hill, citadel of higher education, home of Harvard University, home of BU, Boston College, where I went, and but at the same time, with a lot of hard scrapple operations, and people who, quite frankly, as Alan Lupo reminded us, white people who were going through poverty themselves. When you compare the indexes of South Boston and Roxbury during that time period, and I don't know how much has changed today, very similar in terms of welfare, drug use, poverty, almost identical. And see, that's very unique. And it has to do, I think, with the fact that's been forgotten about, which is how the Irish and some of the ethnic Bostonians, their own struggle for uplift. Doris Kearns Goodwin talks about it in her book, Kennedy's and the Fitzgerald. Uh, Irish kids hit with the ruler, the dunce cap and put in the corner and embarrassed for being Catholic. And one of the reasons that you have Catholic schools that are been very influential is because well before this, a lot of Irish families wanted to take their kids out of the Boston public schools because they were dealing with issues. So it's just a little more complicated. Um, I don't want to take up all the time, but I'll just say very quickly, this trial of Roberts versus Boston, I talked about the myth, the cradle of liberty, but I think of Boston, and we have to come to think of Boston as what some have called, and I also talk about in the book, as the deep north. Just like the deep south, Boston has its own travails with race, and has in the history of the United States. This case of Roberts versus the city of Boston was filed in 1849. It's actually, decision comes in 1850, so sometimes you see that year either 49 or 50. But Sarah Roberts, a young girl who had to walk by about 5 schools in order to make it to there's one school in Boston that would accept Black students. Her father said, that's not fair. And he tried to get her into some of the white schools, and every time they were denied. So he sues the city of Boston in this case. But what a lot of people forget is that they lost that case. Roberts were not successful. The judge in the case in the Mass Superior Court sides with the city of Boston and says it's okay for them to segregate the schools. They don't use the term separate but equal, but this becomes a legal precedent for separate but equal. And it's actually cited in Plessy versus Ferguson, the court case that established separate but equal. Not Georgia, not South Carolina, not Birmingham, but Boston is actually the home of this idea of Jim Crow in so many ways. And so these are some of the things I talk about. I compare Boston busing to, I talk about it as Boston's Reconstruction, a chance to rethink and change this sort of backwards way of thinking, which, nothing is a monolith. For every person you had throwing a rock at this school bus, you had families like the Amalfitanos who were supportive of school desegregation and wanted to try because they agreed with the idea that all people had a right to education. And so part of this is about ethnic mobilization and uplift in the urban terrain. I don't know if anybody remembers this, but the movie The Departed, in the beginning, there's this really interesting monologue. I mean, it's sort of made up and it's based on reality, but he says, something like, the Italians did it, the Irish did it, and then they were in the White House, and Black Bostonians did it too. They had to find a way to get those jobs. If you couldn't get on the police force, if you couldn't get on the fire department, people needed to find jobs and be able to uplift themselves as well. And so a lot of this is part of that. I don't think I know if I know we're getting close to time, so I don't know if I'm gonna not say too much here about this, but I talk about some of the giants in the Black experience, like Booker T. Washington. He had a very deep interest in the city of Boston. He received an honorary doctorate at Harvard, and even though he talked about industrial education and he was focused more on the South, he founded the National Negro Business League in Boston. He actually owned a summer home in the North Shore. And he sent his son and daughter to Wellesley College, even though he used to tell people that, that for African Americans, they didn't need to know about all that kind of stuff. They just needed to learn how to plant a good crop and bring about, study around agriculture. W.B. Du Bois, of course, the famous Dr. Du Bois, is a Massachusetts man and attended Harvard University, worked closely with William Monroe Trotter, who became a friend who also attended Harvard, and founder of the Niagara movement. Spent a significant time in Boston, obviously, when he went to Harvard. And Trotter, who is a real true Black Bostonian, grew up in Hyde Park, was came from one of the richest Black families in Boston at the time, and goes on to found the Guardian newspaper. He becomes sort of moves away from being Black elite and does a lot of other things, and had a very acrimonious relationship with Booker T. Washington. He excelled at Harvard. I talk about all of that in the book. This is a picture of Ruth Batson, who is our cherished and famous, organizer and real leader of the Black educational movement, as she called it. Many of you probably know it's a great book that came out called Common Ground. J. Anthony Lucas won a Pulitzer Prize. It is a great work, I have to admit. But the problem is that in this magnum opus, it's about like 800 pages. They mentioned like people like Ruth Batson and Mel King and the Black movement, maybe like on 3 or 4 pages. It just doesn't speak to the level of history, and so a lot of that was erased. No disrespect to Lucas. I quote the book quite a bit in my own because it is a very strong work, but it had some problems. And so Boston civil rights movement, it's not out of the blue. It comes from a history and a well planned and organizing. The shame is that people were not in conversation with one another. Parents in Roxbury were not in dialogue with parents in South Boston. Had they been, who knows what the outcome could have been. But people were pitted against one another. This is a picture from Birmingham, Alabama, who utilized children in the movement, much like, and I make a comparison to that, because Boston's kids were hostages to fortune, and many of them bear the scars. That is no joke. To walk in those shoes of people who had to go and deal with this day-to-day fights in the classrooms and hallways every day outside. And as a young person dealing with all of that was not easy. And so this was a book that came out a few years back, which really got me thinking about this Freedom North, Black freedom struggles outside of the South. And I wanted to make my contribution. Here's a picture of a freedom school in Roxbury. So a lot of influences and ideas coming from the South, even today, with Black history being something which has basically been outlawed in places like state of Florida. We're returning back to ideas like the freedom schools and some of the things that took place in Boston. So Boston had a vibrant civil rights movement. Here they are singing freedom songs, but I think it was effectively erased from the narrative by books like Common Ground. And that is pretty much it. Thank you.
So folks, let's give Zebulon a big virtual round of applause for a wonderful presentation. And we still have let's take about 10 minutes of audience questions and comments. So Carrie would like to know, what is your take on why a desegregation remedy in Boston that included suburban schools was prevented?
Thank you. Oh, that's a great question. Well, it has to do, and I alluded to the Supreme Court decision that took place in Detroit. Detroit was looking at very similar stuff there with a movement to desegregate. Detroit, as many of you probably know, is majority population there is African American. And so it presented sort of a difficulty in trying to desegregate in the municipal area of Detroit. And so they looked at a metropolitan solution, as they would call it, looking at the outside areas, the suburban areas, and that ended up being ruled unconstitutional. And so, so Garrity's hand is sort of forced there. One of the reasons that this case took so long was Garrity was waiting to see what was going to happen in Detroit, because he didn't want to take a chance that this case here would be ruled unconstitutional. And so that was why, that unfortunately, I should say, because that would have been a more effective remedy, including the suburbs, including, some of the suburban areas. But it was not to be because of that, because of a legal reason. So that's my take on that. But it's a great question, because that really would have been more effective. And you see the voluntary desegregation program called METCO, Metropolitan the METCO program, which utilizes the suburbs and has been very effective.
Carrie also wants you to touch on the role that redlining played, and actually, just could you define what redlining is, and
Oh
and
yeah,
what role did that play in the uh, lack of or this desegregation in Boston schools?
thank you. Yes, it sure does. And redlining, for those, I'm sure most people know, but it's basically involved the government, the federal government, state and local governments, that basically made a sort of rating, a credit rating for all neighborhoods. Green being, go, this is good, good investment. But red being, an area that made it tough to get mortgages and made it tough to basically buy homes there because of that lower rating. And it was called redlining because they shaded in those areas as red. And that has had a devastating effect. Again, it is this sort of through no fault of any one individual party, this confluence of different factors, and that is being a major one, um, that made the neighborhoods more segregated, that made areas, or the ghettoization, I should say, that sort of made it places that were places of disinvestment, abandoned buildings, abandoned, uh, parcels and that kind of thing. And we all know what that does to any place. It just makes it a difficult place to live. And then the schools, were sort of similar in those areas. They didn't receive the funding. They didn't get the books. When they had books, they had things, they gave out books in Roxbury with titles like Little Black Sambo and that kind of thing. You can't learn anything from that. So so yes, that needs to be said. It's not just about, oh, this group doesn't like that group. It just wasn't that simple. It's more complicated than that. And the government has a hand in that, and they have to answer for this too.
Absolutely. Diane said that this presentation was awesome. She thanks you. Christine says, thank you so much for your contribution on this historic topic. Ruth Ellen says this was very interesting and she thanks you. Lisa says, great presentation. Thank you. Judy says, thanks for this great presentation. Some states no longer want this type of information to be shared in our schools or libraries. Looking forward to reading your book. Faye says, excellent, insightful talk. Thank you for raising issues that remain. In order to achieve our full American potential, they demand our attention and resolve. And Zebulon, you talked about why you wrote this book. Could you briefly touch on how you wrote this book? Was this a pandemic book? I don't know how the timing works, but how did you conduct your research? How long did it take you to write the book? Anything you want to touch on there?
Yeah, I did do a lot of the writing during the pandemic, so in a lot of ways it is. But the truth is, and this being such a big topic that it is, it took a long time, of a lot of research, and I started getting very interested in it in graduate school, and so I made it my business just to read all the stuff that had already been published. Then after grad school, it took me, I would say, a total about 7 to 8 years because and a little bit more, doing all the oral history interviews, as many as I could. That was critical. And then there was a lot of existing sources I found out. Places like Suffolk University has an amazing archive, the Joe Moakley archives,
Mhm,
to give the perspective of the other side, so to speak, of the anti-busing
mhm.
uh, part, because I think that was important. And there was just, Boston is no shortage of good writing and thinking, somewhat long-winded at times. So it took a long time to absorb all of it. It's about, I'd say, 8 to 9 years.
Oh wow, well, great for you. So we have reached the hour point. I think I got through all the. I think we addressed all the comments and questions. If I missed any, I apologize. So Zebulon, do you have any last words for the audience before we wrap it up?
Oh, well, just thank you so much. The comments, are quite eloquent and very moving, and kind of restore hope for me, that, the work that we do as historians has value and maybe can help change, part of the discussion. When knowledge is power, as they say. And so, the more we know, it might give a path forward for some healing and reconciliation, because I think it's actually really needed in this case in Boston, and that would be a good thing.
Yeah, no, well said, well said. So, folks, I encourage you to purchase a copy of Zebulon's book. It's available online through your normal online retail sellers, and ask your local independent bookstore to order a copy for you. And of course, use the library. The Tewksbury Library did purchase a copy. We have a copy in our collection, and so that's accessible to anyone in Massachusetts. But encourage your local bookstores, your local libraries to purchase copies of Zebulon's book. So for those who are watching live, look for an email from me later today with a link to the recording, a link to a feedback survey, and information about some other upcoming virtual programs. We do have about a handful of other what I'm calling Black History Month programs, but certainly we touch on Black history throughout the year, but we are doing several this month as well. So I want to thank everyone. I especially want to thank Zebulon. You did a wonderful job as expected, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. So thanks so much, everyone. Have a good one.
Take care. Thank you.
Yeah. Bye-bye.